to the third Democratic Marxism public lecture. My name is Vishwas Satka. I'm an academic here in the International Relations Department. And I've co-organized this with Michelle Williams from Sociology and Devin Pillay. Just to say something about the Democratic Marxism Initiative by way of sort of introduction. The Democratic Marxism space is about three things. It's about a book series, it's about a theory seminar, and it's about these public lectures. And in the main, it kind of originates as a response to the idea of the death of Marxism, the thesis that Marxism is passé, particularly thinking Marxism. But it's really also about recognizing that Marxism as social theory has its limits, has problems, and so to work with it very critically. It's also about trying to test this theory empirically, to really try and make intelligible the new dynamics of capitalism and what's going on in the world, the horizons of resistance and so on. And then lastly, to try and unpack alternatives. What kinds of alternatives should we be thinking about? So that's the kind of context in which the series, public lecture, and the theory seminars are happening. We are very, very excited and very proud to host today Professor Erik Olin Wright. Professor Wright brings something very, very special to Marxism, and he's been on this journey since the mid-70s. He brings to Marxism an analytical and conceptual rigor that comes from his engagement with analytical thought. He also brings to Marxism a sociological, theoretical and orientation, disciplinary orientation. And some would argue that he is one of our leading Marxist sociologists. Professor Wright has, in his work, basically elaborated a very sophisticated approach to class analysis. He's produced 12 books. I mean, some of them titled Class Crisis and the State, Class Structure and Economic Determination, The Debate on Classes. His most recent on class being this book, Understanding Class. This is what we've been reading over the past 3 days in our theory seminar. And really, Erik positions class in a very interesting, class analysis in an interesting dialogue with sociological theories, but more contemporary understandings of class. The other theme in his work, his first book was The Politics of Punishment, when he decided to enter a seminary during the 70s draft, etc.
To avoid being drafted, not out of theological
commitment. And anyway, this is a book on prisons, and it has contributions from prisoners as well. And then, of course, the other big theme that he's really worked on more recently is around envisioning real utopias. And Erik has really tried to kind of think about what are viable, what are feasible alternatives for a new kind of socialism. His most recent debate around some of this has been alternatives to capitalism, proposals for a democratic economy. We also started engaging some of this perspective in our theory seminar. We're happy also to say that these books have been generously donated to us by Erik, and they're going to find their place in the Wits library. Okay. We also have with us, and we're very excited and delighted to have Sarah Mosetsa. Sarah is, I would argue, also a Marxist sociologist, and her book, Eating from One Pot, The Dynamics of Survival in Poor South African Households, has broken ground around the crisis of social reproduction in South Africa. And alongside this, her other academic work deals with labor, gender, and the household. She is currently seconded from Wits University, and she serves as Executive Director of the National Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences. Thank you, Sarah, for making the time to come forward. Before we move on, I'll just say that we have provided some food. The catering should kind of kick in. It was meant to be at 11:30, but definitely after the seminar there'll be some wraps and other things to nibble on and continue the conversation. Over to Erik.
As a prologue to my talk, I want to play the role of an advertiser for an extraordinary play that I saw while in South Africa at the Market Theatre. I go to lots of theatre, and this is really one of the most extraordinary pieces I've ever seen. So if you have even the mildest interest in theater, you should try to get tickets at the Market Theater to The Dying Screams of the Moon. It was written in 1994 by Zakes Emda, I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation, but never produced because, as he says in the program notes, no producer wanted to piss on the euphoria of the transition out of apartheid. It deals with the unfinished business of the transition out of apartheid, particularly around gender and class, and takes what, at least my interpretation, a really bold kind of thesis that's implicit in the argument, which is that actually the race division is the easiest to overcome, not the most difficult. And it's when it intersects class that it becomes intractable. And it's done in a very subtle and powerful way. The audience was just riveted and energized. There were people in the audience who were in the middle of the play jumping up, and you had the feeling they were going to leap onto the stage and join the action. Very interesting, moving. Not difficult. It's not one of these plays that because it's so rich in ideas that it's difficult. It's not difficult. It's very accessible. So, okay, that's my critical review of The Dying Screams of the Moon. I very much encourage you, and it may end up being quite difficult to get tickets. I suspect that for some plays, the word of mouth propaganda about the play is so much more effective than any regular promotion. This was a Tuesday night, and it was a packed house, so it may in fact turn out to be difficult to get tickets, so you should try to do so right away. This is the first time in my entire academic career where I've given an advertisement for a local theater production as part of a public presentation. All right, now down to business. I'm going to talk about the problem of class analysis and how to think through this kind of sociological terrain of there being different approaches to class, which often for sociologists are seen as alternatives. In particular, as you'll see in a moment, I'm going to discuss the Marxian tradition of class analysis, the Weberian, Max Weber tradition of class analysis, and what has come to be known a little bit misleadingly, but I'll use the label, the Durkheimian approach to class analysis. And I'm going to argue that actually these are all compatible with each other. We can integrate them into a broader framework. And in integrating them, it actually reveals very interesting properties of each of the traditions taken separately. But to get to that point, I want to begin by talking about the relationship between the idea of inequality and the idea of class. In lots of discussions, these are just mushed together. You know, class is just a way of talking about inequality. I think these are very deeply connected ideas, but they're not the same idea. So let me begin with two stories that illustrate two different ways of thinking about inequality, and then I'll move from that to how they relate to different ways of thinking about class. Two ways of thinking about inequality, two stories. The first is one that I imagine all of you know. It's Aesop's fable of the grasshopper and the ant. So here's the story in case you're not familiar. It's a wonderful summer day. The grasshopper is hopping around, munching on leaves, and the ants are busy gathering food for the winter. And the grasshopper looks at them and says to the ants, "Why are you working so hard? Life is easy. Relax, relax, come on. Join me in the festival of the summer bounty." And the ants keep working harder and harder, grimly gathering seeds and whatever else ants gather for the winter. Now we're 6 months later. It's snowing, at least in the American version of the story. It's cold. Walt Disney has a cartoon. It's really cold. The ants are in their burrows having a grand old time eating from the harvest of their summer work, and the poor grasshopper is outside blue, freezing cold, starving. So what does all this mean with respect to the problem of inequality? At the end of the story, we can call that the outcome. we have a huge inequality. We have rich ants and impoverished grasshoppers. Massive inequality. And if you ask yourself, how do we explain this inequality? You say, well, grasshoppers and ants behave differently. Maybe we want to say they had different cultures or different characters. We explain the difference in the outcome by the difference in the characteristics of the persons. We have an entirely individualistic account. The behavior and preferences and strategies of the ant and the grasshopper differed. And as a result, 6 months later, one is rich and the other is poor. So we can call that an individualistic view of inequality. We observe inequalities and we explain them by the attributes of the persons that make up that inequality. That's the first conception of inequality. Okay, let me tell you another story. Lots of academics here. Imagine a really mean-spirited, nasty professor who decides for the final exam of his course that he's going to grade the course on a very strict curve. That's a term we use in the United States. I don't know if it's familiar here. A curve means, when you grade on a curve, you decide in advance how many students will get an A, how many get a B, and how many get a C. You decide in advance what the distribution of grades will be. And the students work hard. Some are lazy, some work hard. They have lots of different characteristics. Some are really smart, some are just so-so. And at the end of the whole process, Mary gets the A. And we ask, why did Mary get an A? And we look at the behavior of all the members of the class, and sure enough, Mary just studied herself to death. She worked all the time. She was by far the most diligent, hardworking, and capable student in the class. And she got the A. Now, in trying to explain the inequalities in the outcome, it would still be totally misleading to say that the explanation for the inequality is that there's a distribution of attributes of persons. Some work hard, some don't. The ones that didn't work hard at all got C's, the one who worked the hardest got the A, and the ones in the middle got the grade in the middle. Now, it's true, it's not false, that the explanation for why Mary got the A is that she worked harder than everybody else. But it's a lousy explanation of the distribution of grades, of the inequality in the class. And that's because something else is going on. An entirely different causal process is going on in this story. A process that's bound up with power. The professor, in this case, has power. He has power to decide on his own, independent of the behavior of students, what the structure of inequality will be. And the behavior of students merely explains who ends up in what position, but doesn't explain anything about the structure. So let me just repeat that, because that's really the foundational idea here. The attributes of persons explain who ends up where in the structure, in the distribution, but explains nothing in the story as I've told it, explains nothing about the structure itself. So this, I think, is the big divide in social theory and sociology and in common sense intuitions about the world of inequality. The big divide is between views which fundamentally, in their gut intuition, see inequality as fundamentally about the differences between persons, and understandings of inequality that see inequality as most fundamentally about structures. Now, of course, in the actual world, these things interact. It's not the case that the structure of positions has nothing to do with the distribution of persons. Indeed, in the story of the professor, you might imagine that the professor, if he, in the back of his mind, thought, man, there's a couple of really brilliant students in this class, this year I'm going to give 2 A's. You know, there's a little bit of effect of the characteristics of the student population on the decision to create positions, as it were. But nevertheless, the power to create positions lies in the professor, not the students, and the professor determines what the structure of those positions will be. I would say, as a kind of broad generalization, that economists tend to adopt individualistic views of inequality, in which they, by and large, explain the levels of inequality in a society by the distribution of properties of persons. That's the kind of first approximation of how economists think about it. And some sociologists follow suit. They have similar views, but within sociology, there's a much stronger tendency to see the process by which unequal positions are created as being distinct and involving different causal mechanisms, different processes in the world. That the positions get generated by one set of processes and individuals get distributed into those positions by another set of processes. And then understanding the connection between those two is an additional task. Call this individualistic versus structural accounts of inequality. Now, whoops. There are also two broad families of understandings of class, which we can call gradational and relational concepts of class. Gradational and relational. Gradational concepts of class are signaled by the names given to classes within a gradational approach. You've got a ladder. Sometimes that's even visually displayed in some discussions. At the top you have the upper class. Then maybe you have the lower upper class, and then you have the fabled upper middle class, and then the middle class, and then the precarious, uncertain, insecure lower middle class, then the lower class. And maybe you have an under class. Those are quantitative expressions. They imply a ranking. Persons can be ranked from the top to the bottom. And then there's sort of arbitrary divisions. If you ask somebody, well, what's the difference between upper middle and middle? Well, you know, there's really no barrier. There's no line of demarcation. There's nothing structural that tells you who's middle and who's upper middle. It's a kind of arbitrary and convenient way just of talking. The broad middle class is what? The broad middle of the income distribution or the wealth distribution. Or maybe more broadly, the material conditions of life distribution, if you want to mush all these different dimensions together. And within this broad middle, well, there's a top of the broad middle, etc., etc. Gradational understandings of class have a natural affinity with individualistic understandings of inequality. They kind of fit together. If your theory, if your understanding of inequality is just about the attributes of persons, and you're going to bother to use class as a part of your language of discussing the world, it kind of naturally flows that you map the inequalities of persons onto this ladder of positions and just call them classes. Now, in contrast to gradational notions of class, there are what I would call, or it's not just me, sociologists call, relational concepts of class. One way you know you're in the world of relational concepts of class is that the names of classes are no longer steps on a ladder. They have qualitative names. Lords and serfs, slave masters and slaves, capitalists and workers. Now, what defines capitalists and workers, lords and serfs, slave masters and slaves, is not their position on some quantitative scale, although indeed you can locate them on a quantitative scale. It's rather the nature of the social relations that bind them together. Let's take the very simplest case, slave master and slave. You can't even define the category slave without defining a social relationship that binds that person, that position, to the category slave master. You can't even define the category capitalist without defining a social relationship that binds that position to the category worker. They are mutually dependent on each other. The positions are properties of the relation. Now, human persons fill those positions. So we still do have the problem, as in the case of the grading distribution, of how the attributes of persons explain why some people, some biological, human beings, end up being capitalists and some end up being workers. The study of social mobility is, among other things, the study of exactly that problem. What are the mechanisms in a society that allocate people to particular positions across generations? But the concept of class itself doesn't depend upon the allocation of persons to positions. You could, it's not the world in which we live, but you could imagine a fantasy story in which children were raised and then there was a lottery that determined what classes they would end up in. You had classes, you had strong relational positions, slave masters and slaves, but it was random. You just had a kind of lottery that distributed people. Well, that would not be a very plausible society, because if you had it in one generation and people cared about their children at all, one would imagine that as it were, that the slave masters would want to rig the lottery so that their children would end up slave masters rather than slaves, given that these relations really, really matter for people's lives and how well they go. So, in fact, we don't live in such a world. We live in a world in which the people within these social relations adopt strategies about the filling of positions across generations, so that people who are in the dominant positions within class relations do their damnedest to be sure that they can provide mechanisms, resources, advantages, so that their kids will end up in the same sort of position in which they were. And that's what would be in the sociological discussions about inheritance, about intergenerational transmission of privilege. All of that is part of the class analysis about how, by virtue of being in a position, you can give advantages to the next generation so that they too can be in those positions. Gradational versus relational understandings of class. Now, what I want to do is to discuss how we can bring into alignment and enhance the value of each of these traditions of class analysis, different relational concepts of class. Different relational concepts of class. Because it turns out, for various reasons, some of which are actually political and ideological, but some of which are just interior to sociology. They have to do with sociologists trying to solve particular problems. Turns out that there are different ways of understanding the nature of the social relations that constitute a class structure. And I want to show one strategy for how we can bring them together. 3 traditions of relational class analysis. Now, it would take us way too long for me to give you, a kind of thorough and detailed, analytically clear exposition of Marxist, Weberian, and Durkheimian approaches. I'm going to just skim the surface and give you the synoptic account of how each of these traditions defines class relations. In the discussion afterwards, if you want more clarification on any of these, of course, I'll be happy to do so. Let me just give you the brief, distilled version. First, the Marxist understanding of class relations. Marxists define class relations in terms of what are called the relations of production. Relations of production are the social relations which organize how people gain access to economic activity. In a capitalist society, the key dimension of the relations of production, not the only, but the key dimension, is ownership of the means of production and ownership of your ability to work, your labor power. That's your ability to work. And the class relations of capitalism, accordingly, are defined traditionally in the Marxist tradition as the social relations that bind together owners of the means of production with people who don't own the means of production but do own their own labor power, and it binds them together through the employment relation. Workers sell their labor power on a labor market to capitalists who hire them and are able to hire them because they own businesses, that is, they own the means of production. And then they set them to work inside of production, doing the various tasks that are needed in order to produce whatever it is that they're producing. That relationship is a complicated one. I mean, I've just given you the stripped down version. It's a complicated one because it involves both ownership and dispossession. People come to the world with different, the persons enter with different assets when they form this relation. But it also involves relations of domination. Because it's not enough for the capitalist to simply hire the worker. The capitalist also wants to direct that worker's work. And that means you have to have power inside of the production process to tell people what to do and to enforce it if they drag their feet about it. The domination relation is a really interesting one within the class relations of capitalism, because in most capitalist firms that are anything but the tiniest of firms, that power is delegated to people who are themselves hired by capitalists. Well, that's interesting. We now have a class structure in which the owners of the means of production delegate the capacity to dominate to managers, who then direct the labor of workers. And one of the complications of understanding the class structure of capitalism is that kind of complexity, that inside of production you have all these relations of domination that don't exactly correspond to owners and non-owners. And that's a theme that I've developed in my own work as a way of how we should understand the complexities of the class structure of capitalism. Okay, that's actually more than I was planning to say. Carried away by the wanting to delve a little bit into the nuances of this. That's Marxist relations of production. Max Weber, great founder of sociology, we joke in American sociological theory courses that the courses always begin with the three dead white men of sociology, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. Well, Weber is one of the trilogy of the Trinity, maybe to really elevate their spiritual standing within this discipline. The trinity of founders of sociology. Max Weber was a great theorist, and he didn't write a lot about class, but what he did write about class has been immensely influential in the development of the sociology. He defined classes in terms of the social relations that people enter into in the market when they exchange things. And he referred to this as the market capacities of people. People bring all sorts of assets to bear when they enter into social relations in a market. And in particular, in capitalism, you have some workers who enter the market with no skills. All they have is their brute labor power. You have other people who enter the labor market with all sorts of skills, and furthermore, skills which have a kind of property right character. We call those credentials. That is, they have a kind of skill in which the state authorizes them to sell their skills and says if you don't have that credential, you may be just as skilled. You could be a fantastically skilled surgeon. You learned your surgery on the fly. I don't know how you did it, but all power to you, but you couldn't sell your surgery skills on the market unless you have a medical degree. That's credentialing, and that's a kind of property right? So in Weber's view, it's not the case that there's only one kind of relation that is generated within a market. There's many kinds of relations, depending upon what sort of asset you bring to bear on the market exchange. Weber's understanding of class then is rooted in market relations, and the key idea that's associated with him is this notion of market capacity. The third tradition of class analysis, which only recently has gotten labeled Durkheimian, or a little more precisely, neo-Durkheimian. An American sociologist named David Grusky wrote a series of papers announcing that his approach to class was neo-Durkheimian. And it's a looser connection because Durkheim never announced himself that what he was doing was proposing a particular way of understanding class. But I think it's not an unfair label. It captures something about what David Grusky is certainly doing, and Grusky's approach certainly captures what lots of sociologists do. And that's to identify class very closely with the division of labor, or as a shorthand with occupations. In Grusky's analysis, you can have many, many classes in society, not just 2 or 3, depending upon how you want to think about it. You can have many classes defined by the social relationships involved in the construction and reproduction and solidarities of occupational positions. He refers to his analysis as an analysis of micro-classes, because there are many occupations. At one point, he even suggests, and I couldn't tell if he was being serious or teasing the reader, that economists and sociologists were 2 different classes because they have such occupationally closed worlds in which they construct their relations within the academy. I think that was meant to be a tease rather than a serious proposal. But it reflects the spirit of his analysis. So he refers to his work as microclasses and is very critical of what he calls theorists of big classes like Weber and Marx. But I think the way to think about this, and it's again a common sort of way that people think about class, is that class is very tightly connected to occupation. And the number of classes is not something that you know until you actually study how occupations work. Do they constitute bases for collective action? And if they do, if they have enough solidarity that binds the people in an occupation together, then that constitutes that grouping as a class engaged in conflict with other classes. Those are our 3 perspectives. Now the task is to show how we can put them together, that treat them not as 3 perspectives, but as 3 points of entry into a more integrated class analysis. I will also argue, and this is perhaps a more, as it were, partisan position, that the best way to integrate these is from the vantage point of a Marxian account. That is, the Marxist dimension of this integrated model changes the way you think about the Weberian dimension. And the Marxist and Weberian together changes the way you think about the Durkheimian position. The reverse is also true, actually. The way you think about the Marxian is affected by connecting it to the Weberian. That is true, but I don't think I don't think the impact is as deep. Another way of putting this is that all Marxist class analysts have always been implicitly also Weberians. They just didn't always recognize it. But Weberian class analysis have been explicitly non-Marxist. They reject the Marxian level, whereas Marxists don't actually reject. They may rhetorically, but when you actually look at what they do, including Marx, when Marx actually gets down to business and starts talking historically and empirically about classes in the 18th boom era of Napoleon Bonaparte, all of a sudden all sorts of Weberian categories enter the story. But the reverse is not true. In my early work, I was, I think, honored. I think this was a tribute by a sharp critique by Frank Parkin, a well-known British sociologist, who criticized my early work on class in a book called Marxist Class Theory of Bourgeois Critique, in which he said inside every neo-Marxist is a Weberian struggling to get out. And a few years later, I was writing something in which I could legitimately put the sentence, inside every left-wing Weberian is a Marxist struggling to stay hidden. And that reflects the fact that these different traditions of class analysis do have something to do with each other. They do speak to each other. My task is to render this explicit and systematic. And here is the inspiration for this is captured in this wonderful poster. This is from a Marxist feminist collective in 1979, a Canadian, this is a Canadian poster. The poster shows a working class woman with her elbow on a fence. And the captions say, class consciousness is knowing which side of the fence you're on. Class analysis is figuring out who is there with you. And I would add, there's also the problem of figuring out who's sitting on the fence. Class analysis tells you, so to speak, in the context of conflict, who are your friends, who are your enemies, and who are your potential allies. And an ally, as opposed to a friend, is somebody who does share interests with you in the battle of whatever sort, but also has interests that are not identical to yours. You have to find the common ground to get them, in spite of the fact that they're sitting on the fence, to get them to help you out. Now what I'm going to argue is that what differentiates Marxist, Weberian, and Durkheimian analysis is the nature of the fence around which they construct their class categories. And that we can think of these fences as nested within each other. There's a kind of systematic hierarchy of fences, and the fences fit together. Well, I won't keep the fence metaphor. It doesn't actually, doesn't work all the way down, as it were, in this story, but I think it suggests what's driving the analysis. Okay, now I'm going to fill in a bunch of boxes within a schema to show you how I can integrate these, or try to integrate these class analyses. I'm going to do so by using a game metaphor. Now I know some of you who are super sophisticated, when you hear the word game invoked in social theory, you begin to quake. Oh my God, he's going to talk about game theory, rational choice. No, don't worry. I'm just using game as a kind of metaphor, a way of thinking about society. I'm suggesting that you can think of a society as a kind of game that has rules, and then people adopt strategies within those rules. Think of a sport as the metaphor. If you're thinking about a sport is a game. You could have a society in which there's a decision to be made what sport should be played. People with different body types would have interest in playing one kind of sport or another. You know, if you're 2.5 meters tall and very agile and strong, but in that kind of loose-limbed, agile, tall way, basketball is your sport of preference. If you're shorter and stocky, go for rugby. And you can see in a world in which you had to choose, you're going to have a hegemonic sport. All the money, all the status is going to go to one or the other. Rugby players and basketball players would be on opposite sides of the fence over what game to play. We could describe them as two classes within the struggle over games, sports. Now once basketball wins, let's say, I'm sure that's just my American prejudice, and in South Africa there'd be more resonance with rugby winning, but basketball wins. There's still the problem of what rules to play. Basketball's rules have evolved over time. There are always rules that are consistent with what one might call the underlying logic of basketball, but some of these rule changes have made a pretty big difference in how the game actually is played. In the 50s, there was a very important rule change which allowed players to touch the rim of the basketball hoop. Before that, you couldn't dunk the ball. Now, one of the most dramatic plays in basketball is the dunk, you know, where some giant of a person leaps into the air with that whole ball in the palm of their massive hands, and they slam it down the basket. Just as a little anecdote, one of the consequences of introducing the dunk was an engineering problem about how to make the basketball hoop and the backboard not get destroyed by dunks. And in the early days, there were examples of somebody who would dunk the basketball and the whole apparatus would fall apart. So they had to strengthen the physical infrastructure of the game. Well, that changed the game, and it gave advantage to some people over others. And then there's moves in the game. Once you've got a fixed set of rules, these are the rules, players. If you break the rule, you get a foul. Once the rules are set, then training regimes change. Training regimes change. Players discover hidden strategies that they didn't know existed before because under the prior rules, these wouldn't be relevant strategies. We're seeing that right now. We're in a transition right now to what I think may end up provoking some rule changes in basketball because of the strategies that have developed around the three-point shot, which are changing the rhythm of the game in pretty interesting ways, but we don't know how it'll settle down. Okay, we've got what game to play, rules of the game, moves of the game in a sport. But we can make the same set of distinctions for a society. We have what game are we playing? Well, we're playing the game of a capitalist democracy. Let's just, for the moment, restrict it to the economic game. It's the economic game of capitalism. Capitalism comes in a whole variety of flavors. There's many different kinds of capitalisms. They have different rules. You can have neoliberal capitalism, which we're suffering under at the moment. You can have social democratic capitalism. You can have various kinds of hybrid forms with some neoliberal rules and some social democratic rules. You can have what is called organized capitalism, where there are lots of centralized institutions to coordinate the behavior of capitalists and workers. And you can have disorganized capitalism without such organizing institutions. There are lots of different rules of capitalism. And once you have the rules of capitalism, then workers and capitalists and other actors adopt their strategies. How can I maximize, improve my life, advantage myself in competition with others, given the rules we're playing under? These different levels of the game we can think of in terms of a social system as we can use a language of social systems to describe these as three levels of a system at which conflicts are focused. Conflicts can be focused at the system level over what game to play, at the institutional level over what should be the rules, or the situational level. Sometimes Marxists used to call this the conjunctural level. You know, the concrete level of the here and now practical level in which people are actually acting. You can call that the situational level. And corresponding to these, in the game of capitalism, there are different political forms of conflict. Conflict at the system level can be thought of as conflict involving revolutionary versus counter-revolutionary politics. What are revolutionary politics? What is this when it actually happens in the world on the rare occasions it does? It's the political mobilization of parties and other collective actors to try to change the nature of the game itself. And counter-revolutionary politics is trying to maintain or restore the existing game. Reformist versus reactionary politics are struggles over the rules of the game. That's way more common in capitalist democracies, and indeed in capitalist societies more broadly. Reformist versus reactionary struggles are the mainstay of historical moments in democratic societies when there is a lot of political mobilization over change. One can think of the neoliberal era inaugurated by a series of political struggles in the 1970s and intensifying in the 80s. One can think of neoliberalism as a reactionary, that is, it's attempting to strengthen and restore capitalist conditions in the face of changes in the rules which had strengthened more social democratic and welfare rules of the game of capitalism, as a pretty successful onslaught to change the rules. 15 minutes, yeah, that's just, it might take 18, but not too far off, okay. And finally, ordinary interest group politics, that's politics in which the rules are taken as given. The rules aren't in play. People are just engaged in political struggles within the rules. When you have standard, boring political conflicts over such things as whether we should build a new soccer stadium or not. You know, the conflicts over whether a city should host the Olympics. is a struggle over how to allocate state resources for particular projects, but it's not a struggle over what the rules of allocation should be. Strikes of workers. Strikes of workers mostly are just struggles to improve wages and working conditions under a particular regime of labor relations. Occasionally, of course, strikes can become struggles over the rules. Strikes can become general strikes. They can become strike waves in which the power of capital may be being challenged in order to create new rules. And new rules need not necessarily be just restricted to new laws. New rules can be new norms, new conventions, new ways of understanding what's possible and what's not possible. So sometimes struggles at the level of moves of the game bleed into struggles over the rules of the game. And also sometimes struggles over the rules of the game kind of bleed into struggles over what the hell game are we playing anyway. Sometimes you're struggling over particular rules that are sufficiently fundamental to the nature of the game that you're actually beginning to change the character of the game. That, by the way, also happens in sports, just anecdotally. Part of the history of sports is how gradual changes in the rules of one sport begin to violate something about the underlying logic of the game. And then there's a leap, often it's a quite rapid one, where a whole new game is formed. It ceases to be the same game, and you end up with two games, not one. I think it's the case that there's something like that going on in the history of rugby and soccer, but I'm not sure. There's something in the primordial history of these sports where they bifurcated in their early years as people decided it'd be awfully nice if we could tackle each other. And other people said, no, that's violating the integrity of the sport. Okay. The stakes in the game of capitalism, of revolutionary versus counter-revolutionary politics, is capitalism versus socialism. The stakes in reformist versus reactionary politics is varieties of capitalism. What kind of capitalism are we going to have? And the stakes in interest group politics is over immediate economic interests. How can we improve our advantages or disadvantages of others through our conflicts over state resources, state programs, and the like. Now to the punchline. Marxist class analysis is built around the problem of what game to play. The class categories are defined at the level of the game of capitalism itself. And the purpose of developing that class analysis is to understand the nature of conflicts in a capitalist system that potentially point towards the transformation of capitalism itself. Weberian class analysis is anchored in the problem of the rules of the game, the varieties of capitalism, the way different rules of the game will advantage or disadvantage people, categories with different sorts of market capacities. Durkheimian class analysis focusing on occupational groups that are jostling for position within the space of occupations and markets. Durkheimian class analysis is all about immediate economic interests. If we think of it this way, then it's not surprising that Marxists, when they are studying the mundane politics and struggles of within capitalism, in practice adopt Weberian categories, even if they don't so label them. Marxist discussions of the emergence and development of social democracy and the problems of exclusion by trade unions, when trade unions create barriers of entry, create insiders and outsiders, that sort of problem. When Marxists discuss that, they sound a lot like Weber, because that's what Weber is all about, is how organizations of skilled workers, when they form unions, create barriers. And the result of that, the union members receive, to use an economics term, a rent component in their wages. They push their wages above the market competitive wage. Well, that's a Weberian argument, which Marxists are totally comfortable with, but typically don't say, aha, this is what Weber's talking about. But that's really the way these two different frameworks are articulated. Weberians, however, don't see those kinds of struggles as kind of components of a potentially larger conflict over the nature of the game itself. These three traditions of class analysis, in a sense, in the history of sociology in the last 40 years or so, correspond to different periods of capitalist social conflict and ideological prevalence. So, in the 1970s, when I began my work in sociology and in class analysis, in 1970s, the opposition of capitalism versus socialism in the Cold War was just taken for granted. Nobody thought there was no alternative to capitalism. Conservatives thought the alternatives were terrible. Radicals thought the alternatives were desirable. But it wasn't really in question that there were alternatives to capitalism. And they were broadly labeled capitalism and socialism. And Marxist class analysis seemed to have a natural fit with the ideological and political conflicts of the era. In early 1980s, Thatcher declares there is no alternative, by which she meant there is no alternative to capitalism. And it was the era in which, within economic sociology and political science, the theory of the varieties of capitalism, VOC as it came to be known, the varieties of capitalism, that really developed and became central. And it was also the period in which Weberian understandings of class, Weberian class analysis, especially embodied in the work of John Goldthorpe, who I think is probably the leading class theorist within that tradition, developed in order to give account of the nature of conflict and collective organization across the varieties of capitalism. That was one of its central purposes. And Goldthorpe engaged in both kinds of discussion, varieties of capitalism and the kind of rules of the game that bore on class relations. In the neoliberal era, which sort of begins sometime in the 1990s, intensifies in the 2000s, I mean, the dates aren't so important, these are obviously overlapping. TINA, there is no alternative, is no longer, there is no alternative to capitalism. It becomes there is no alternative to neoliberal capitalism. And there is a reduction in the variation of rules across capitalisms. Now, not a disappearance of variation. Sweden is still different from the United States, but it's less different from the United States today than it was in 1980. Sweden has had a neoliberal transition, less complete, with more and important remnants of the social democratic era, but nevertheless has had that transition as well. And it's no accident then that David Grusky's Durkheimian micro-class analysis comes into its own in the era of neoliberalism. It's the class analysis for neoliberalism. Now, I would say that while there is this rough correspondence between these different traditions of class analysis, this doesn't mean that Marxist class analysis loses relevance in the neoliberal era. Indeed, I mean, I wouldn't say it's more relevant, it's just as relevant, I would say, throughout these periods. It's just as relevant because, in spite of the fact that the rules of the game seem to have converged ever more to more like a single model with just small variations, in spite of that fact, there's every reason to believe that the rules of the game of neoliberal capitalism are themselves precarious. That the rules of the game of neoliberal capitalism are not the future of capitalism from here on after, but that we are entering into an extended period in which the rules of the game will themselves again come under question. And Weberian and Marxist class analysis provide us with the class analysis tools, that's not the only tools we need, but the class analysis tools to understand the nature of conflicts, coalitions, and struggles over what kinds of objectives that will emerge once it becomes historically possible for the rules of the game to come into play. And potentially, for the rules of the game to come into play in such a way that the game itself comes into play. What I'd like to do to conclude then is to return to Marxist class analysis and to delve a little more deeply into its core substance. Not just its place within this hierarchy of class analyses, but what actually is the content of that theory. And this means elaborating in particular the concept of exploitation and its connection to domination. But exploitation is the more difficult concept. Now, in discussing the lecture I was going to present with various people, there was some disagreement as to whether it would be a good or bad thing for me to have this coda, this last part. There's partially a time issue. I mean, do I have enough time?
5 minutes.
So this is more than 5 minutes. This is probably
You can play with it.
okay. All right. So I'm being given permission to do that. There was some feeling that what I'm going to talk about now, the way I'm going to talk about it, not the concept, but the way I'm going to talk about it, has such American cultural specificity that it may just be bewildering to people. I think with a little patience, you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. So I'm going to explain the concept of exploitation by telling you a third story, the saga of Little Abner and the Shmoo. The Shmoo. Little Abner is a comic strip that appeared in Sunday newspapers in the United States from the late 30s through the 70s, I believe, although it may be that they were just doing repeats by the 1970s. The author's name was Al Capp. Lil is Little. Abner is a hillbilly. He lives in the Ozark Mountains in the state of Arkansas. A stereotyped, poor, backward, uneducated, rural area, filled with stereotypes of how people in such conditions live and what their values and purposes are. Little Abner himself is a very warm-hearted person who basically wants to do good in the world, but is kind of bumbling about it. In one episode in 1948, he discovers a very strange animal called a shmoo. A shmoo, they're about this big. They look like a giant pear with whiskers. Very strange animal. You'll see in a moment what the shmoo looks like. Here's the backstory. During World War II, the United States Army dumps radioactive waste in the mountains of the Ozarks. And that produces a mutation of some pre-shmoo animal who becomes a shmoo. My hypothesis, although I have no direct evidence, is that the pre-shmoo was a wild turkey. They kind of look turkey-ish. The shmoo has the following powers. They have one purpose in life, which is to make people happy. That's the only thing they care about. They make people happy by turning themselves into things that people need. They have this capacity for rapid metamorphosis, self-transformation. Furthermore, they're telepathic, so you don't even have to tell them what you need. They just do it when they read your mind. They don't, however, turn themselves into luxury. So if you wake up in the morning and your body needs a bowl of oatmeal, bang, you've got a bowl of oatmeal. The shmoo has turned itself into oatmeal. If you want a plate of caviar, you're out of luck. The shmoo won't do it. It provides you with basic needs. Oh, and by the way, because they care so much about people, they replicate themselves before they produce the oatmeal. And so, thus you never run out of them. Pretty amazing, you never run out of the shmoo. The shmoo taps into a very deep part of Western culture. Our origins myth, every culture has its origins myth. Our origins myth is the Garden of Eden. When God kicks Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden because of the sin of eating of the tree of knowledge, various punishments are imposed on humanity from thereafter. Things like death. I mean, it's pretty severe treatment. But one of the punishments that God inflicts on Adam and Eve is, from now on, you will have to earn your bread by the sweat of your brow. What does the shmoo do? The shmoo restores us to the Garden of Eden. Literally, the bread, which is the kind of symbol for basic needs, is given without any effort. Basic needs for all. Manna from heaven. So it's this fantasy of the restoration of Garden of Eden, where you can be as lazy as you want. And the dog patch residents, indeed, are really lazy. They really like to just sit around. But they can do so without suffering the grasshopper's fate. They have the shmoo. Well, that's the context of the story. Then in 1948, an industrialist from the East Coast decides he wants to build a new factory. His manager has done a very comprehensive research project and finds the poorest community in all of the United States is Dogpatch. That's where little Abner lives. And so they're going for a site visit to see about his factory. Okay. Now all of this may seem a little strange. Why am I talking about this? As you will see, all of this I'm using to provide a sociological analysis of what the concept of exploitation means in a way that does not depend upon any of the technical apparatus that Marxists usually use in discussing exploitation, like the labor theory of value and other sorts of things. This is a way of getting at what's sociologically powerful about the idea of exploitation. So what I'm going to do now is show you the comic strip and sort of act it out, and then draw the theoretical lessons from this. And the theoretical lessons are genuinely serious lessons, even if the way I'm getting there is a little flippant. And now, PU, we're coming to a spot where folks are so ignorant they never dream of asking for more than we're willing to pay. And they'll never get rich on that. Here they haven't been spoiled by that silly fad of working a mere 7-hour day. These miserable rats are in such desperate need they'll work for a good old-fashioned 16-hour day. You're a bright boy. How did you find such a splendid spot to move our factory? Statistics show that there's more undernourished people in Dogpatch than any place. Those are the kind I like to deal with. They're so grateful. Bless them. These poor ignorant wretches will be grateful for the chance to work 16 hours a day, 7 days a week for $7 a week. They've never heard of anything better, and we'll never tell them. Oh, you're a bright lad. The board may well pay you a $500,000 bonus again this year. Remember, this is $1948. Probably it's a $7 or $8 million bonus by contemporary standards. It shows that Al Cap didn't actually predict the way the world would be like, because now for something like this, you'd probably get a $50 million bonus. So anyway, back to the story. But maybe we can pay him even less. Question one of them. How would you like to earn $7 a week? Did you say $7 for just 1 week? Or no, I said 6. That would have been a tremendous fortune, BS. What do you mean, BS? Before schmooze. Only 18 hours of hard labor a day. Only 7 days a week. And you pay us $6 for just that? That would have been my juicy proposition, BS. Meaning before schmooze. Now you can see my hypothesis about the wild turkeys. These are the schmooze in the picture. But nobody what's got schmooze has to work anymore. And anybody can have them for free. Schmooze does everything. Everything? Oh, I suppose they provide you with the necessities of life. Milk, butter, eggs, meat. Stop laughing, you fool. Great Scott, PU. Do you realize what the shmoo means? Nobody will have to work hard anymore. Now, I'm just going to take a little editorial aside here. It's quite remarkable that the capitalist is a Marxist, whereas the Dogpatch residents are Weberians. Now that may not seem obvious to you, but I'm going to quote, nobody what's got schmooze anymore has to work anymore. The Dogpatch resident sees the shmoo as disrupting the relations of exchange. You don't have to work anymore. Whereas the capitalist says, do you know what the shmoo means? Nobody will have to work hard anymore. The capitalist recognizes that the threat of the shmoo is to the extraction of effort from people. Whereas the Dogpatch resident thinks it's just going to disrupt going to work at all. For the Dogpatch resident, it disrupts market exchange. For the capitalist who understands the inner workings of capitalism, the shmoo disrupts exploitation. Okay, back to the story. But who'll do the long, dirty, back-breaking labor in our canning factories? Nobody, and what's worse, nobody will need our canned stuff anymore. The shmoo provides all types of food, fresh and free. Free food for everybody. That's horrible. The shmoo must go. It's either it or us. Thank heavens its sinister influence hasn't spread yet. Blast you, Wormley, why are you stopping? Because I've quit. I snuck a brace of schmoos under my coat and dog patch. Now I've got a whole herd of them. I'll never have to take your guff anymore. Back in New York, I'll forget the shmoo menace by taking Choo-Choo to dinner. That poor showgirl has been unemployed so long she'll even go out with me for a square meal. I'd love to go to dinner with you, honey pot. Whoops. I'll get you a big steak and you can take that steak and slap your own fat face with it. There's good schmooze tonight. This little addendum to the story, which Al Capp doesn't pursue around gender, in some ways is even more remarkable in the historical context than the main body of the story, which is about how the shmoo disrupts class relations. Because while coming out of the Depression and the general ideological context of public debates among intellectuals, Al Capp would have been fully familiar with ideas about exploitation and class, it wasn't just part of the ordinary understanding of things in 1948 that male domination rested on the material dependence of women on men. It's not that that idea had never been spoken, but I don't think it was part of the lingua franca, the ordinary understanding of New York intellectuals in the way that the class exploitation thing was. Al Capp was no feminist. I mean, Little Abner is a super sexist comic strip if you look over all the strips in it. I think the way to interpret this little addendum is basically the way a social theorist would. He's following out the logical implications of his model. You know, it's as if you did a thought experiment. Just imagine a world in which everybody had schmooze. What would be its implications for class? Aha, nobody will have to work hard anymore. What would be its implications for gender? Aha, people don't have to put up with people like this manager. Women don't have to put up with it. It's a threat to gender domination as well as class. That's a kind of discovery from the logic of the model, as it were. And a more remarkable thing in the historical context. All right, well that's the story. Now I want to draw the lessons from it. The first lesson comes from just asking a question. What is the rank ordering of preferences of different classes for the fate of the shmoo? Remember that classes are defined by conflict of interests. That's what defines the fence. What's the fence around the shmoo? What are the preferences if you could do whatever you want with the shmoo? There are four possibilities in this very simple, stripped-down world of only capitalists and workers. Everybody gets a shmoo, only capitalists get shmoo, only workers get shmoo, or nobody gets the shmoo. These are our four options. And let's look at the preferences of the capitalist class and the working class, in which they're asked the question, what's best for you? Now, of course there'll be some religiously motivated capitalists who, in spite of their interests, might want workers to have schmoos. We're bracketing out actual flesh and blood people whose moral judgments are more complicated than just material self-interest. We're just asking the simple material interest question, which is the class question. That's what class is about. It's about material interests of actors. What's the rank ordering for capitalists? Well, their first preference is that only capitalists get schmoos. So capitalists like oatmeal and eggs and milk. The second preference is destroy the schmoos. If I can't have them all for me, get rid of them. The third preference is everybody gets the shmoo. If I can't destroy them and I can't monopolize them, well, all right, everybody gets them. And the worst option is only give the schmoos to the people who need them most. Pretty mean. What about workers? The first preference is that everyone gets the shmoo. Now the reason for that is, remember that the shmoo only provides you with basic necessities. But many people are going to want to have an income above basic necessities, which means that since they don't own the means of production, they will have to go to work. And all things considered, it's better to work for a capitalist who has a shmoo and therefore has a little more flexibility in offering wages than a capitalist without shmoo. So a selfish worker, not caring about the well-being of capitalists, he's just concerned, or she's concerned with him or herself, still wants everybody to have the shmoo. Second preference, only workers get the shmoo. Third preference, only capitalists get the shmoo, because after all, it's still better to have capitalists who don't have to pay for their oatmeal. And the worst preference is destroy the shmoo. Now just think about this juxtaposition of these two rank orderings. This isn't just a difference in interest. This is a really sharp polarization of interests. Because capitalists have an active interest in the deprivation of the poor. They're not just indifferent to the plight of the poor. It's not just callousness. They have an active interest in the harms of people. That's a pretty morally fraught kind of social relationship. Furthermore, think about it this way. If you were to ask a great moral leader, people who are universally admired for their moral wisdom and judgment, Jesus, Buddha, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, just if you were to ask them, what would be your rank ordering of preference on the basis of your universalistic moral feelings and compassion? They would give the same rank ordering as the workers. They would say everybody should get the shmoo. Duh, of course they should. And if not, only the poor should get it. And then, if that's not possible, at least the capitalists have it, they'll be a little bit better off for the poor. And the worst is to destroy it. That correspondence between the self-centered interests of workers and the moral coding of universal interests of humanity, that correspondence of those two rank orderings, I think, is the meaning of the classical Marxian idea that the interests of the working class are the interests of humanity. I think that's what that means, is that workers are not, Marx is not saying that workers are more moral than anyone else. He's not engaging in the kind of romantic view of the victims of oppression, that they somehow have higher moral stature than their oppressors. He's not saying that. What he's saying is the fight against oppression is in the interests of humanity, because the moral coding of interests in that fight corresponds to, I mean, he doesn't use moral language, of course. This is my take on Marx, corresponds to these more universalistic, humanistic views about human well-being. Okay, this is the characteristic form of conflict, of interest, that's embedded in the logic of exploitation. And that's why exploitation is not just any old garden variety conflict. It's a conflict in which you have interdependence of actors that depend upon each other, combined with this degree of intensity of opposing interests. And we can make this argument more systematically analytical by defining exploitation in terms of three principles. And I've got, this is about 5 minutes more. All right. Quicker. All right, well, what I can do is skip over this analytical reconstruction of the argument we've just done. This is where the real sociological theory then nails this down. But you can read it if you are interested. On my website, nearly all of my books are available as PDFs. And my publishers reluctantly let me do this. And if you look at chapter 1 of Class Counts, I go through this step by step. And in that chapter, you also can have the shmoo story. Okay, so I won't go through all this, much as I like talking about it. But I'll just go to the final punchline. And the final punchline is this. This is the fundamental implication. Poverty in the midst of plenty in a capitalist society is intrinsic to the class structure of capitalism. It's not an accident. It's not just something that happens contingently. It's intrinsic to the nature of capitalism that you have poverty in the midst of plenty. The rich are rich in part because the poor are poor. It's not grasshoppers and ants. It's a structural problem in which the rich are rich because the vulnerability of the poor being poor enables the rich to extract surplus and effort from the poor. And therefore, the nature of the class conflicts generated by such a structure, implicitly, if rarely explicitly, involve calling the game itself into question. Not just the advantages of different moves of the game, nor simply the rules of the game, but at least the aspiration for a game in which this is no longer true. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Erik. Hi, everyone. Did you know that feeling when you're thrown in the deep end and you can't swim, literally? In fact, I think even the notion of swimming is an inequality issue, a class issue, right? Because I can't swim. And I'm learning. It's a race issue, of course it is, in South Africa. But before I forget, and I have a few things to raise, I think I want to just raise four things, Erik, just in case I forget. I think you talk about Marxist, you don't talk about Marxism, and in South Africa, in recent days, we've been talking about Marxisms. So I think it would be important for you to just come back on that, and why are you using Marxist instead of Marxism or Zins, right? The role of education in your analysis, I think, is important. I think, especially in the context of South Africa, I think it would be important for you to come back to it. I think I was struck by this slide. Sorry, I'm going to appropriate.
Sure.
It's called appropriation in capitalism. I mean, I think, given what happened yesterday and today, everyone wants to go back and see the voting. It's interesting that you can even look at this and do a state analysis, do a South African state analysis, and talk about the nature of the current state. Is it Marxist? Are they, what form of class analysis are they doing? They're doing a Marxist, Bavarian, or Dicamian. Or, as Erik is saying, maybe they're doing all of them, and maybe that's the schizophrenia in our state, maybe. I'm not going to say anything definitive today. I'm just going to raise comments and questions, so don't hold me to it. I think the fourth thing, which part of my talk, in my response to Erik's presentation, speaks to this. The fourth thing is, what if we were to invoke, to include, to add other theories or theorists into this integrated class analysis, especially in the context of South Africa. So if we were to discard all of these dead men in sociology, the founders, what will come out of this integrated class analysis, as Erik has I think, convincingly, for me at least, presented? I think this is where the talk starts. I want to first commend Michelle and Vish and many others who are part of the team for creating a space to talk about class in South Africa today. I think 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we were talking about class in South Africa because we wanted social change. I think in the recent times we're talking about other things, not class, and I think that's where the challenge of social change comes in, when we find other variables. And I won't talk about them, but maybe I will talk about them. But not just in South Africa, at Wits University, the kind of discussions that we're having at Wits University in recent time are not about class, and I therefore, I think, appreciate this conversation. Not class in isolation to other conversations, but class as part of those conversations. I think that's where most of the social change will come from, or most of our responses. I think, Erik, I'm sold in terms of your analysis and your framework, or your integrated class analysis framework. It makes sense to me. And maybe it's because Vish has dubbed me a Marxist. Someone said to me, I should ask Erik whether he's a Marxist, because part of everything that he's been doing has always been about Weber, or a Weberian understanding. But he's clarified, he's a Marxist, but with some Weberian connotations in terms of what he's always been talking about. But I want to raise 5 key issues or comments that I think an average South African sociologist, a first-year student, an activist, a COSATU activist, or many other activists, AMCU and many others, might be asking about this framework. So indulge me in pleading some of my ignorances. I'm speaking on behalf of South Africa. No. First, I think I said 5. I think I want to just raise 6 things very quickly. I know that we need to have time for discussions. Typologies, theories, frameworks make sense, but they only make sense if they can be applied universally. It's a theory, it's a typology, it's a framework. Therefore, it has to be universal in application. So it does not matter whether you have a smoosh in the US or something else in South Africa. It should be applicable. Right? So let's talk about how applicable or universal is this framework that Erik has presented to us today. Can it be applied at a theoretical, methodological, but also practical level? I'm talking about the activist. Can an activist take this framework and say, I can change the world? Right? Methodologically, when I engage with the many households and the individuals in KZN based on my research, can I apply this framework? Or maybe I'm using a framework or this particular way of understanding in a very crude way, but also theoretically. What are the key concepts that are coming out of this way of understanding class in contemporary societies? But often than not, let me rephrase. I think part of this framework and part of what Erik is talking about is based on particular key assumptions about society, or the society that you're talking about, Erik, which in some ways, those assumptions might not be often universal or often true in the context of South Africa. So what are those peculiarities? What are those key assumptions about the individual in the US and the individual in South Africa, the state in the US and the state in South Africa? We all have problems of the state. Some have more problems these days than others. We're happy as South Africans, but others have more problems. Therefore, the first question is how can we universalize and indeed use this integrated class analysis in the context of South Africa today? Some of the key assumptions of the framework do not really work in the context of South Africa, where this society is very fluid, where your class position, and I know this is an individualistic way of looking at it, where your class position can change in a matter of hours. Think of that word councillor somewhere in Eastern Cape. Right? But more importantly, the history of South Africa is so, okay, let me just talk about specific, the dispossession by accumulation, the history of South Africa in terms of land dispossession in South Africa is a particular one. And when you do class analysis, I think it's important to recognize that history. But also, that just the current context in terms of income and inequality and the attempts by the state to redress. So that was the second point. The third point is that what is the point of class analysis if it does not assist us in capturing the lived experiences of class itself? The lived experiences. As we know in South Africa, the lived experience or the reality of class, beyond the theory now, the lived experiences and reality of class are shaped fundamentally by the subjective experiences of gender, of race, of citizenship, and many other things that we can consider. I could talk at length about this, but I want to move on to the fourth point. But more importantly, there are two institutions that we need. We as sociologists, we love them because we start with them. We first start with, so I'm going to do a detour. We first start, even in sociology, first-year sociologists, and some of them have been tortured by this. We indeed, even in South Africa, we start with Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And in second year, we discard the two, right? You'll decide which two we discard, but we discard them almost. Right? But also in first year sociology, what we tend to do in first year sociology is talk about a particular institution. We call it the family. Maybe we don't teach the family anymore in sociology. But if there are two institutions that we tend to ignore when we do class analysis or even have this theoretical discussion, it's the household and the state. And especially if we're going to talk about relational, understanding class in relational terms. In the context of South Africa, the experiences, processes, and understanding of class are shaped by what happens at this particular institution called the household. Right? Indeed, sometimes we also do the opposite, which we talk about the household income and then we measure, inequality, class, right? Forgetting that not all of that income is used for the benefit of all. And indeed, this very altruistic understanding of the household, which comes with class analysis, often misses other realities of gender domination. The other institution that we really often forget as sociologists when we do class analysis is the role of the state. Because class and the experiences of class are mediated, I'm using that very deliberately, mediated through TRC style, right? Truth and reconciliation style. The state often mediates class and our experiences of class by giving either creating or pseudo-creating further classes or mediating between the two competing classes. And in this case, it's either, and I'm going to use a very big word that we have not used thus far, the bourgeoisie and those who don't own the means of production. Let me move on, and I don't want to spend time here. And indeed, the state either tells us what game to play or the rules of the game. And some people who voted yesterday, like me, we either decided whether we want to vote for this party or that party based on whether we want this party to just change the rules of the game or we want this one to change the game itself. All right? Let me move on to my fifth point. And this one is going to be, maybe it's not well thought through, and I apologize, Eric and everyone else who's listening. How do we use the framework to understand the following individuals in South Africa? Martha, a former teacher in Zimbabwe and a domestic worker in South Africa not covered by the law, therefore no minimum wage and no trade union. Solely the chairperson of a cooperative in Zampilo, in informal settlement, a cooperative that makes and sells bread, has vegetable gardens and sells those to the community. Zanele, who runs a daycare center from her own backyard, receives child grant for two of her kids. Her husband works as a rock drill operator at the Rustenburg mine. Tembi, highly qualified, experienced, who works for government as a chief director and earning on average 900,000 per annum, and lives with her two kids, unemployed mother, grandmother, uncle, sister, and two nieces in one house. Brazeix, who was a ward councillor yesterday, but was voted out and lives with his wife, who is a school principal and has 3 kids. And finally, Sipho, a breadwinner, and has been working for 8 years as a ward councillor and continues to be a ward councillor. So, now I want to conclude with this. I don't want to waste more time. I have one more point. All of these individuals, indeed, from the framework and from the theory, we could indeed assume that I'm merely doing this individual attributes class analysis and it will be most appropriate. But if you consider in all of those identities and all of those names and the stories that they come with, is that if you consider race, gender, citizenship, household, and the state, the framework becomes very complicated in South Africa, but very exciting for a sociologist like myself in going back and doing what I need to do, which is not an armchair sociologist. Finally, how do we use this framework? And I'm going back to the practical. How do we use the framework to imagine, again, utopia, to imagine a different society, a different South Africa? Where are the moments of change, and where do you see the moments of change, and who should be driving that change? Thanks, Erik.
There's a lot there to respond to, and of course, if I attempted to go through all that point by point, we wouldn't have time for more discussion from the floor. So just let me make a few points to some of the issues raised. On the issue of Marxist versus Marxisms, and am I a Marxist? I do self-declare myself to be a Marxist, and others object to my self-designation on the grounds that by virtue of being open to theoretical ideas from all sorts of other traditions, I have become an eclectic sociologist who just picks and chooses from different traditions as I wish. And I suppose the accusation is correct, but I don't consider it a sin. I think the purpose of being an emancipatory social scientist, that is one who attempts to produce knowledge for the purpose of struggling against various forms of oppression, is to identify which bodies of thought and where we can discover the crucial mechanisms and processes that both generate oppressions and obstruct our possibilities of transformation. It's the central problem of an emancipatory social science, is to identify the causal processes that underwrite oppressions and the processes that obstruct our capacity to transform the world. I call myself a Marxist because I think with respect to a set of very fundamental issues, Marxism as a tradition of thinking provides the grounding for approaching these problems. And above all, because it relentlessly poses the possibility of an alternative. Other frameworks of critical thinking rarely are as preoccupied with the problem of what's the alternative. And I think an emancipatory social science requires both a diagnosis and critique of the world as it is, and a vision of an alternative that's desirable, viable, and achievable, and then a theory of how to get from here to there. And I think Marxism provides a grounding for that, but it hardly provides a full understanding of all of the processes implicated. And that's why I am a Marxist and a feminist, but not a Marxist-feminist, because I don't think these can be amalgamated into some unified theory in which all the pieces fit together in some totality. Rather, what we need is an open theoretical imagination where we identify different causal processes that enable us to understand those generative processes that generate the oppressions and the obstacles and barriers to their transformation. In terms of issues of the household and the state and a whole variety of other ways in which class analysis needs to be rendered way more complex than I suggested here, this of course was just a sketch of a rudimentary point of departure for class analysis. In my work in trying to go beyond this rudimentary expression, I indeed do try to systematically discuss the family and the household, and to discuss the way in which we should best think of the interconnectedness between class, race, gender. I haven't focused so much on citizenship, but it would certainly equally fall within such a domain. What I resist is the idea that we should pack all those other dimensions interior to class analysis. I think it's a virtue, not a flaw, of class analysis that the concept of class itself is gender blind and race blind. Because that's what makes it possible to specify the forms of interaction between class and gender deeply, which mutually constitute each other in the world as interacting forces. Just to give you an analogy, when a biologist studies the effects of water on plants, what the biologist does is take 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen and calls it a compound, but doesn't study the separate effects of hydrogen and the separate effects of oxygen on plants. It's water on plants. Now, if class was like that, if class and gender really are like that it's only in their forms of combination that they have consequences, then indeed we should get rid of the concept of class and the concept of gender and replace it with clender. That is, it's the compound which does all the work, not the separate concepts. But that's not, in fact, a plausible way, I think, of understanding how class and gender work. And that's why every theorist, no matter how insistent they are on intersectionality, still uses the term gender. They don't abandon the term gender. And that means they want a gender-blind, a class-blind concept of gender, but then to not have a class-blind analysis of the way gender works in the world. So I have a gender-blind analysis concept of class, and a race-blind concept of class, but not a race-blind and gender-blind class analysis when I deploy it to understand particular problems. That's a kind of complicated way of perhaps defensively justifying a class analysis that doesn't, in the first instance, bring inside of its own conceptual structure race and class. But I do that in order to better understand the connection with race and class, not to marginalize race and gender, not to marginalize those additional concerns. In terms of how you use this framework then in practical work, my hope is that indeed understanding these complexities and the interconnection between moves in the game, rules of the game, and the game itself, and understanding those in class terms, does indeed give activists who are theoretically minded and want to think through these things better tools to deal with the complexities that they encounter, the contradictions between the different modalities of these relationships under different conditions of struggle. Above all, this way of nesting these different ideas together, if you really get it in your bones, it means that even when you're engaged in struggles over moves of the game, just trying to improve the conditions for that co-op in the township selling its vegetables or whatever it's doing, you are constantly aware of the implications of this for possible changes in the rules of the game that could make the existence of those co-ops more robust. And constantly thinking about what alternative game could we even be playing in which the whole dynamics of the way worker cooperatives would interact with other social forms in the society could improve human flourishing. So this is just a way of keeping all of those balls in the air simultaneously, even if you're focusing just on the most narrow of practical considerations. Okay, I think I'll stop there just to open this up to the floor. And I guess we have about 20 minutes.
Yeah, I want to end it in 10 minutes actually because somebody else is using this room and we're going to have our meeting.
Okay.
Let's take a couple of questions. Back there?
Is that me?
Yeah.
Thank you. My question is, Bourdieu. How would you position Bourdieu in relation to this framework around forms of class analysis? I understand that Bourdieu is not a class analyst, but he does throw up his work does throw up some interesting questions.
Right, sure.
Thank you.
I prefer actually to give brief answers, even if I can't give complete answers one by one, rather than accumulate a bunch of questions. So Bourdieu does talk about class. He focuses on the way a person's positionality within a kind of space of class relations shapes things like their tastes and their struggles over boundaries and things like that. I find Bourdieu extremely difficult to systematize. Even though he uses the term class. Not impenetrable, but just difficult. I find the empirical work always fascinating, and then his attempt to abstract from the empirical work and give us a framework just elusive, in which what he's trying to do, I think, is to develop an account of the impact of a person's lived experience on the formation of their dispositions and subjectivity. That's the whole habitus problem. And then his locating that within a class analytic framework is an attempt to specify how the kinds of power relations which I'm concerned with impact on the formation of those dispositions. But I still find it difficult to really formalize myself. So that's why I've never written an extended essay on Bourdieu. I have passing comments, but I haven't wanted to tackle it because I just don't have a good feel for how it works.
Okay, let's just do this systematically, Eric. Let's take a hand at the back there, and then we'll come back to this side. Right at the back. Yeah, that's you.
Yeah. So I don't really understand how, maybe we can explain further how you can sort of separate the the race question, or especially in South Africa, even in the US, to try and give an account of class outside of really speaking about the race, because the race question shapes class in so many ways. And it's sort of getting tiring that we always come to these seminars and we have to emphasize the fact that the lived experience of the black is different from the white experience, and you can't like reduce it to a footnote where it's taken as just another variable, as if it's not like an overarching factor in how we relate with the world and how we as black people understand the world. And you know, I feel like it seeks to erase somehow and a very critical and important analysis of how a black person lives in the world and how they're supposed to live. So I'm uncomfortable with you, and I'm not advocating for intersectionality, but I'm uncomfortable with how it seems to me that we are reducing the race question. And I mean, you know, even like how the best sociologists that you mentioned, Du Bois is not in them, and I have problems personally with that. How you can speak of class outside of race, or how race can be a different variable, you know?
Okay, so let me try to answer that question. The reason Du Bois isn't one of these, isn't a fourth or form of class analysis, is I don't think he had a distinct logic of class analysis. That wasn't what class figures in his analysis all the time, but he doesn't have a distinctive class analysis. It's very Marxist. And so he would be a variant within the Marxian class analysis that looks at the nature of how the system of class relations work. But let me directly address the question of class and race. So the first question I would ask is, there are black capitalists in South Africa. Do they exploit their workers in the same sense that a white capitalist does? So is the class dimension of their structural position, is the class dimension somehow different by virtue of them being black, and therefore their ownership of the means of production, their power to deploy capital as they wish, to move it abroad to Swiss bank accounts if they wish, and to invest wherever in the globe they wish, is it somehow racial? Is there something about their race which renders that power different, and therefore requires that even in the specification of their the class dimension of their conditions of existence, one has to racialize it? Now, that's an interesting question. I mean, I don't think it's not a trivial, it shouldn't be by assumption that one says, no, the class character of their position has the same mechanisms involved. And my reason for wanting to define the class mechanisms separate from race, and then when you apply it to a case like South Africa, you would immediately have as a central problem, how do you bring the race and class dynamics together? The reason I want to do that is because, in fact, I think black capitalists are just as exploitive as white capitalists, and they're doing it through the same mechanisms. They're doing it through the same mechanisms. And that's obscured if one says, no, the class concept has to be racialized from the first instance. Now, the analysis of South Africa, if my assignment, so to speak, for the lecture had been do a class analysis of South Africa in 2016, I mean, it would have been a daunting task since I don't study South Africa, so to speak. If I had taken on that responsibility, then the first thing I would have said is this. I would have said, look, I need to just clarify some concepts so we know what we're talking about. But my task is to understand the dynamic interaction between race and class and how that affects the lived experiences of people. So the lived experience of a black capitalist indeed will be different from a white capitalist. I'm not saying that their lived experience, their form of subjectivity, the way they might form coalitions or not, the extent to which they will potentially be allies in certain kinds of struggles. I don't know the answer to those questions, but I would presume that the racial dynamics of South Africa would impact on those questions. And to understand that, you'd have to really understand how race and class interact. The question then is whether that task is best facilitated by first clarifying the logic of the concepts without race being a part, and then bringing them together, or whether one has to always, from the very beginning, bring these other dimensions to bear on the analysis. My judgment then is, just to repeat myself, that it's important to have clear and universal concepts which get de-universalized and particularized in their application to the context that vary enormously. So I hope at least that helps you understand where I'm coming from, even if it's not a fully satisfactory answer to the problem. How do you actually do it in the ground if you're actually doing a class analysis in such a highly racialized context as South Africa?
Thanks, Eric. Let's take a hand here. I'll come down.
Yeah, hi. Two worries, one about exploitation and one about classes. So the one about exploitation was in the use of the schmoo. But that seems to me just a way of introducing the category of what an economist would call a non-economic good. In other words, a good that's available in abundance, in the same way that water can flow abundantly from the spring. Now, as you say, Marxism is interested in offering an alternative to a capitalist society that's viable and feasible. And of course, most people would think that the idea that we can never get to a stage where even basic goods can be satisfied by basic needs can be satisfied by non-economic goods, in other words, goods that are available in abundance, is a bit utopian in the sense that it could never be realised. We can never have goods available in abundance. So if we're going to define exploitation with reference to abundance, that seems to commit us to a view of a non-exploitative society that could never be realised. So one alternative way to define exploitation might be to go to the counterfactual thought experiment that Marx offers in the Gunrisse, and he asks, well, what would happen if everyone tried to maximise their monetary wealth? And he argues that it would be impossible. So an alternative way of thinking about exploitation might be to say, here's what capitalists do, can it be universalised, or can it not be universalised? Because that wouldn't commit us to this assumption about the possible future existence of goods in abundance. That's my worry about exploitation. Maybe I'll leave the one
Okay.
last.
Thank you.
So I use the schmoo case just as a way of clarifying a particular form of interdependence between people, where the well-being of one depends upon the deprivations of the other. And the mechanism involved in that interdependence involves the appropriation of effort. And the schmoo story is just a way of doing a thought experiment to reveal the intensity of that interdependence and interest. It's not, the implication of the schmoo story is not that the end of exploitation requires an exogenous, non-economic schmoo, manna from heaven, at all. It doesn't say anything about the nature of the structural conditions under which exploitation can be eliminated. It's just that's not the purpose of the model. It's not a model of a post-capitalist society that's being implicitly proposed by schmooness. It's to say that the antagonism between labor and capital does not depend upon an antagonism over the redistribution of anything from capital to labor. It depends upon the nature of the interdependency of their interests, this antagonistic interdependence. Now, I think, that's enough to, I think, respond to the specific thing about the schmoo story and abundance. I don't know whether the counterfactual that you were suggesting is a better way of illustrating the core concept of antagonistic interdependence, where the rich and powerful have active interests in perpetuating the deprivations of the poor, of perpetuating vulnerability, because that's what enables them to extract effort. On the face of it, I don't know why universalizing capitalist strategies would better illustrate that point. And that's the point of the schmoo story.
On this side, Robert, and then I'll come.
And then I would like, no women have asked questions, so I would
Are
like...
there any women? Ron, go for it.
You make it clear that you engage in abstract conceptual analysis and abstract conceptual clarification, and the concrete analysis you combine different concepts, like race and class in the South African context, and the US context, of gender, whatever. Now my question is, whether you are completely open-minded about the outcome of the concrete analysis, or is there a bias towards class emerging in the concrete analysis, not conceptually, as the ultimate determinate force, even if you take into consideration all the other forces, or is completely open-ended?
It depends entirely upon what you're trying to explain. There's some things that we've studied in which there's good grounds for believing that class is absolutely at the core of the problem, and other things which we might be have no views on, and other things in which we know in advance that class is of secondary importance. I think it's entirely dependent upon the questions you're asking. If we're asking questions about the household division of labor, for example, I don't think class is the fundamental determinant of the internal division of labor of tasks within the household, although it impacts on it. But if we're asking about the mobility of capital globally and its search for maximizing profits through the hyper-exploitation of labor in certain parts of the world where they're politically vulnerable, I think class is pretty central to that. And I would be really surprised if the gender dynamics of the global flows of capital are of central importance in explaining why jobs are moving from the United States elsewhere. Now, it may be that gender dynamics in local labor markets helps to explain why some sites are better sites for that capital to move to, but not why they're exiting the developed capitalist world. So I think it's entirely problem-centered.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, there is a French academic, I don't know if he's already there, Pierre Rosenvanon, who came up with an interesting book entitled The Utopian Capitalism. He was talking about communism, like Utopian capitalism. I mean that there is no substantial difference at all between Marxism and capitalism, because they are all materialist. And they cannot be emancipatory, because you are talking about conflicts of interests which are simply materialistic. And we know that the environment defined by Darwin is the survival of the fittest, which is why we can have a socialist society but still have exploitation as we lived it in the Soviet Union, for example. So we need, for a new emancipation, we need the change of perspective. And for me, I think we need a spiritualistic change of perspective. And I don't see Marxism playing any role on this.
So I agree with you entirely that in order to transform the world, to encourage human flourishing and universalize human flourishing, we cannot focus exclusively on the material conditions of life. I don't believe that it's a logical consequence of saying that the material conditions of life and the struggle of interests over basic needs of people, that this is important and has animated many severe conflicts in the world, that claim about the world also implies, I don't think it implies, that the only necessary condition for human emancipation is the transformation of people's access to resources and the material conditions of life. Indeed, I mean, the values which I say are central to an emancipatory project, there are three values that I focus on. It's equality, democracy, and community, solidarity. And under equality, I specify that the egalitarian principle is that all people should have equal access to the social and material means to live a flourishing life. And the social conditions for a flourishing life include access to recognition, and one could add to kind of spiritual, if one means compassion, among other things. So no, I don't think this isn't material. This is materialist in one sense, but not another. It's materialist in acknowledging the importance to people's lives of being well fed, of having access to clean water. I mean, all the things which are the stuff of struggles over the material conditions of life, that really matters to people. And if you're deprived at that level, that's a severe harm to human flourishing. And it's a necessary condition for human emancipation to overcome those barriers. But it does not imply that it's the only condition for full emancipation.
I want to bring this to a close. We can continue the conversation over lunch. Thank you to all of you for coming and for the incisive engagements. I just want to also say a very, very big thank you to Erik. He taught us a different way of doing critique. In his introduction, he talks about departing from fault-finding critique, combat, which is typical of Marxism, slay the other side, and introduced us to virtue-finding critique. And I thought that was very valuable, searching for the common ground. In the process, he hasn't lost Marxism. On the other hand, I really want to thank Sarah for engaging the sensitivities around translating Marxism, putting it to work in the South African context. I think all of that was excellent. Now, just an announcement. The Democratic Marxism Theory Seminar will continue next week. We will have Vivek Chibber in South Africa. We'll be reading his critique of post-colonial theory. There will be a public lecture similar to this one. It will be co-hosted with WISER, the Sociology Department and the International Relations Department. It will be on Thursday, 11th August at 5 p.m. Vivek Chibber will be presenting and the respondent will be Ashil Mbembe. Okay, so please try and come and make yourselves available. Thereafter, there'll be 2 other panel discussions, probably around September, October, one on race and the other one on gender. So keep that in your diary, on your radar. Thank you for coming. Thanks, Erik. Thanks, Sarah. That was great. That was great. Hey, did you enjoy it?
Okay, now that